Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name's Joe Fish. I'm Principal Research Scientist in ET, and I have the great pleasure of being able to introduce Casey Fiesler today. Casey is a professor at CU Boulder, and I've been trying to get an opportunity to bring her in and talk to Mozilla for about 2 years now. She's done a whole bunch of really interesting work. In addition to a whole bunch of this sort of human-computer interaction work around communities and how people think about that, she also has a law degree before that, so she has a whole side of her work around privacy, ethics, questions like that, and the legal side of these things. And I think that combination really talks to the stuff that Mozilla cares about, right? It talks to the stuff that we think is important in the world. And I think her insights are going to have ramifications across the company. I particularly am excited about this work, and I particularly asked her to do this work about AO3, Archive of Our Own, because it's such a successful community, right? It's so good at bringing in contributors and building something out of that massive community. And again, to me, this seemed like exactly the sort of thing that we wanted to see, we wanted to do at Mozilla, and we want to learn from at Mozilla. So, Casey, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to you, but thank you very much for coming.
Great. Thank you. So I'm really excited to be here, and I'm particularly excited to talk to Mozilla about Archive of Our Own, because I've always thought that some of the great things about this community really resonate with the values and goals of Mozilla. So I have been studying this particular community for quite a while now. Let me do some definitional work first. So, first of all, if you have never heard of fan fiction, what I mean by fan fiction are people who are writing stories about Harry Potter and Star Trek and continuing adventures and romantic relationships between characters you never thought would get together and this kind of thing. I've actually been looking at these communities in the context of the internet since the early 2000s when I first started studying HCI. And I also was a big part of this community. So one of my first experiences with the internet was that I discovered Star Trek fan fiction on Usenet when I was a teenager. And I've always found this community to be really remarkable, both in terms of the massive amounts of user-generated content that it's creating, and also the general positive atmosphere of the social community, which I think is quite different than a lot of things we see online today. Another important thing to know about the fan fiction community, and also other kinds of fan works in this community, like remix videos and art, is that this did not begin with the internet. So you can trace fan fiction back to Star Trek zines, or even earlier. I mean, you can really go back to like Jane Austen, Sherlock Holmes book clubs. But what we think of as traditional media fandom today really took off with Star Trek. And so people were making fanzines and stapling them together and mailing them to each other for a very long time. And then Usenet became quite a popular platform, and it really changed the community, allowed it to disseminate very broadly and to bring a lot more people together. The community has migrated across many different online platforms over time. Yahoo groups were quite popular in the early 2000s, and then LiveJournal was a hugely popular platform for this community in the mid-2000s. And I want to focus on that for a moment, because I'm basically tracing the history of Archive of Our Own here. And LiveJournal is really important, because in 2007, two things happened regarding LiveJournal that ended up kicking off a larger movement in the community. So the first one was that LiveJournal made some policy changes that the fandom community saw as unwelcoming to their community. It had to do with definitions of adult content, for one thing. But more egregiously than that, the platform just deleted a huge swath of fandom-related journals without any warning. And this was called Strike Through 2007 in the community. It was this really big deal, and they saw this as a sign that The platforms that they were using were not built for them. Something else happened around the same time. So this was right when YouTube was getting really popular, and I can imagine that around this time there were a lot of VC meetings trying to build the next YouTube, right? User-generated content was really taking off, and there was a brief venture to try to commercialize fan fiction. So there was a website created called FanLib, and the idea was, oh my gosh, all of these women have been creating fan fiction for the past 30 years and no one's been making money off of it. How can we make money off of this? And as I just mentioned, women. Traditionally, the demographics of fan fiction communities has been hugely women. And as you can see, they did not have a great idea for their demographic, because the ad here like shows a man getting muscles because he starts posting his fan fiction on FanLib, I guess. There was not a single woman involved in the creation of the site, not on the board, etc. And it also really butted up against the strong social norms of the community, against commercializing. My dissertation work was actually about copyright and remix, and so a lot of what I looked at were the gift economy of fandom and the norms around copyright. Anyway, suffice it to say, this was also not built for them. So there was this idea in the community that the platforms they were using didn't welcome them, that other platforms were coming and trying to exploit them. So around that same time, someone wrote a blog post, well, it was on LiveJournal, of course, and basically said, I know we have project managers in this community, and coders and designers. Can't we do this? Seriously, we can come up with a site that would be miles better and more attractive to fanfic writers and readers than anything out there, because we actually use it. We need a central archive of our own. For those of you who might be familiar with her, this is actually the science fiction writer Naomi Novik. She was also getting a PhD in computer science for a while before she became a full-time writer, and was a very well-known fan fiction writer in the community. I interviewed her as part of my work, and she gave me permission to use her real name because this is not a secret. You know, most ideas like this don't go much farther than ideas. This is quite an undertaking. We are going to build a brand new platform that will do what LiveJournal is not doing for us. But what this resulted in is archive of our own. This is what the interface looks like. It's a fan-created, fan-run, non-profit, non-commercial archive for transformative fan works. Mostly fan fiction. You can post other works there, though it doesn't currently host things like video. To give you a sense of what this looks like in general, it launched in 2008. The basic gist is that you can find stories here from literally any source material you can possibly think of. From several 100,000 stories set in the Marvel universe, to at least one story about anthropomorphized universities. I looked last night, there are a few stories about the Mozilla Firefox on there. Yes, maybe don't look them up. But basically anything you can possibly think of, there is work here. So this is actually a slide from when I did this presentation quite like this almost exactly a year ago, because I wanted to give you a sense of how fast the site is growing, as well as how big it is. So last year around this time, about 1.5 million users and almost 4 million works. As of last night, exactly 2 million users. I don't know when this happened. It was exciting. And nearly 5 million works now. So this is huge. I mean, this is a user-generated content platform And most remarkably, it is designed, developed, maintained entirely by people in this community. As I mentioned previously, the fan fiction community is predominantly women. The data that I'm about to show you is from a census that a fan took of Archive of Our Own community in 2013. Though I've done some survey work since then on fandom generally, and my findings are quite similar to this. So for example, more people on AO3 identify as genderqueer than identify as cis male. And as you can see here, mostly female identified. There are also a very large number of queer people in fandom. So if you look at sexuality, here we saw about 30% of respondents identified as heterosexual. In my more recent survey work, it was more like 22%. So I was very interested in this community, and in particular in Archive of Our Own, because of this idea that a community could build its own thing, decide what it wanted to be, make all of the decisions, and that it was being created by groups of people that are traditionally underrepresented in computing. So I'm going to tell you a story in general, but most of the things that I'm talking about here came from an interview study that I conducted in 2015 with a number of people who worked on the development of the site as well as users, et cetera. I've also done a few large-scale surveys since then about platforms on fandom in general, so some of this data comes from there as well. One of the most striking things about decisions early on in the development of the archive was that there was an idea that this is our front page of the internet. This is the Fanish community. It is for us, by us. We support everyone. And in particular, the way that Naomi put it to me was, how are we going to get enough people to not just build this thing, but maintain it? We're going to have to grow our own. This was really critical because there was a initial value-based decision to not bring in outside developers, that it was extremely important that it was built and designed by people who are already part of this community, and that if there weren't enough of them, they were going to create them. It is open source. This is the current GitHub page for the archive. Anyone can put in a pull request, but again, the core group of developers are mostly volunteers who are in this community. They also built a nonprofit around the archive to support it, as well as some other projects. It's called the Organization for Transformative Works. I am on the legal committee for this organization and have been for quite a while, though I've not had any interaction with the development of the archive. So I'm going to go through a few design things about the archive that I think are really interesting from a designing for your own community standpoint. Though one of those actually starts with philosophy first. So there is this, as I'm sure a lot of you know, sometimes in the geek culture community, there's a lot of gatekeeping. Who constitutes a real geek, etc. It's very important to the kind of ethos of Archive of Our Own that if you say you're a fan, you're a fan. You belong here. Whoever is reading this page, if you have come across the site, you are welcome here. And one of the ways that this philosophy made its way into the design has to do with inclusivity and accessibility. So for example, Archive of Our Own is a remarkably accessible website, particularly when it comes to working with screen readers. So though this was a very small development team, it was extremely important that they got this right from the beginning. And a number of people that I talked to, both the developers mentioned, as it says here, everything had to be accessible, otherwise it's not added. They had people with assistive technology provide feedback, and users that I talked to also mentioned this as being important. Someone mentioned their mother who has vision problems, and that there was thought she saw built into AO3 in a way that wasn't in other websites. Another way that they try to be accessible is that there is support for works on the site being in many different languages. There aren't automated translation tools, but a small army of volunteers have translated all of the documentation on the site into many different languages. And again, there's support for posting fan fiction in whatever language you like. And also allowing users to translate other people's fan fiction and tying those together in the back end in a way that they are easily found. But the number one thing that people talk to me about in terms of the design is the search and tagging system on this archive, which was built to address a few things that were very important in the community. So this is a tag cloud that you see if you go to search by tags on the site. One thing that was very important to the designers was that they were making no value judgments about what you call things. If you think about search systems generally, there's a typical trade-off, right? So either you limit how people can tag things so that search works very well, or you don't limit how people can tag things, but then search doesn't work that great because if you use weird words to describe things or you misspell things, they don't tie it together, et cetera. And so the solution to this is that they created a system called tag wrangling. It has turned the search system and Archive of Our Own into a curated folksonomy, which basically means you can call something whatever you want, and behind the scenes there's a real person who is deciding where that fits into the taxonomy of tags. So for example, this shows the sort of wrangling back end for mermaid. So if on your story you tag it with merpeople or mermaid Sherlock or what do I got to tag to tell you it's a mermaid? There is a tag wrangler whose job it is to tie all of those things to the term merpeople. These are volunteers. They tend to be tied to a particular fandom. So like, you know, you love Harry Potter so much that like in your free time, you're gonna be tag wrangling for Harry Potter. And a lot of people also do it for these more obscure fandoms just because they want to help the archive, they wanna make it better. It does require a lot of labor, but it's been 10 years now and there's not been a problem with not having enough, even as the archive grows. Because the people who are working on this do it because they love it so much. They want to make it better. And the other thing that is great about this search system is, again, it doesn't make any judgments about what you can call something. So, for example, one of the developers talked about this early decision and said, we knew that people called things by different names. If you wanted to write a Buffy Spike fic and you really wanted to call it Spuffy, we didn't want to stop you from doing that. So thinking about how you manage creating tags for potentially infinite universe source texts and what people will want to say, that's where the tagging system came from. So I spoke to a number of users who would compare and contrast this to other sites. So for example, on fanfiction.net, you can't have a romantic relationship between more than 2 characters based on the way that you can do the tagging system. So they would mention that kind of thing, or, you know, I was able to use the words to describe people in the way that I want in terms of gender or sexuality or whatever it happens to be. If you want to read more about this, there's actually a great recent story in Wired by the internet linguist Gretchen McCullough about how fans are better than tech at organizing information online. So this system has also resulted in some very purposeful design decisions around how you can search for things and how you filter things. So another way of thinking about inclusivity is that you want everyone to feel welcome there and also safe. Fandom tends to have a fair number of people with disabilities or who are dealing with mental illness. And there's a lot of discussion around content warnings, trigger warnings, et cetera, in this community, and it's something that's very important. In designing the archive, they took into account existing conventions and fandom. So if you go back 10 years and look at stories that are being posted on LiveJournal, one of the things that you would see is the same type of content warnings over and over again. There started to become social norms in the community around things that you have to warn for, basically trigger warnings. And so when you look at stories in the archive, you'll see a series of tags, some of which are things you would expect, like character, relationships, genre, etc. And you also see this one in bold here that says graphic depictions of violence. That's one of their required warnings. So there's a set of warnings that are more than are listed here that are things that the community has decided you should always be warned if that's in the story. And so when you post something, it will say, are any of these things here? And then you can choose to say, choose not to use archive warnings. Maybe you're unsure if it applies, maybe you don't want to spoil the story, maybe you just, whatever it is, you don't have to, but then it basically becomes a read at your own risk kind of situation, which the community quite appreciates. And then actually a feature that they added, I think only 3 or 4 years ago because of great demand, was the ability to basically blacklist certain tags. So when you're searching, you can exclude whatever you want to exclude so that it doesn't show up in your search warnings. These icons here represent different things that conventions said in the community were important when you're searching for stories. So the little exclamation point means there's a required warning here. The exclamation point question mark means I don't know if there is, read at your own risk. Rating, type of romantic relationship, etc. So another thing that's quite interesting about the way that Archive of Our Own came to be and that the community has progressed over time is that, as I mentioned earlier, there has been kind of a migration across platforms. So a lot of these conventions have been picked up over time. A couple of years ago, I did a large-scale survey where I asked people what platforms they used. I was only looking for people who had been part of this community for 10 years or more, and so it was quite a large swath of time. I know you probably can't see this very well, but so there's a red bump that goes off and then drops off fairly precipitously. That is LiveJournal. And there's 2 lines that kind of go like this. Best Friends Forever, Archive of Our Own, and Tumblr. But you can see that a lot of the platforms here have dropped off and stopped being used over time. And even worse, sometimes things just disappear from the internet, like GeoCities. There were a ton of fan fiction archives on GeoCities, and then one day, bam, they're just gone, right? So another thing that's been very important to the fan fiction community is preservation. Preservation of content so that it doesn't disappear forever, like if GeoCities goes away. and also preservation of their history. So for example, also around the same time, around 2006, 2007, YouTube becomes a thing. Suddenly there are all of these news articles about this amazing new art form of remix videos that have apparently been invented by men. And a lot of people in the fan community were like, wait. Women have been doing this since the 80s using VCRs. And so there was also this idea that we didn't want the history of fandom, particularly as a type of women's work, to be erased. So one thing that the archive did to address this particular problem is something called open doors. It will allow anyone who has a fan fiction archive or who knows of one to basically allow the content to be imported quite easily, to be sucked in wholesale to the archive, given its own space. They have a way of contacting authors to make sure they don't have a problem with that, and they've managed to basically rescue a bunch of archives in this way. However, this value towards preservation also can butt up against another really important value in fandom, which is control over your own content. So for example, as one of the developers told me, a lot of people wanted the feeling early on that they could wipe out their fanish identity in an instant if they had to. They wanted to be able to disappear, which becomes considerably more difficult on the internet. Very frequently, you wipe out entire swaths of a community's history with you. So basically the idea is if you decide that you want your fandom identity, which is always pseudonymous, people in fandom rarely go by their real names, you should definitely be able to do that. And so people were deleting all of their work from the internet in order to disconnect it from their fanish identity. But as a result, it destroyed some of the community history. So a design feature that they built in the very beginning is something called orphaning, which leaves stories on the archive, but posted with no connection to a real person or even a pseudonym. If you decided that you wanted to delete your identity on Facebook or Twitter, all of your content would go with it, right? So this allows you to disconnect your identity from the work entirely, but to not destroy the work itself. There are some other really interesting features to mitigate these kinds of tensions. There's the ability to tie multiple pseudonyms together, and understanding that people in fandom have used multiple platforms over time, and sometimes people have different identities across them. A lot of really interesting design decisions, some of which are specifically built to either reflect the values of the community or to mitigate these value tensions. And all of this design, again, was done by people who are part of this community. Because of these values, because of issues of empowerment, inclusivity, preserving values and cultures, they really prioritized training up fans to do the work. This was not actually all that surprising to me because I'd been hearing stories about people learning technical skills in fandom for a really long time. For example, one of my interview participants said that she taught herself Python because she wanted to program a stupid little program that would list different characters and give her like a romantic pairing at random to write stories about. So she taught herself Python just so she could do that. And she said, because fandom was there, it gave me an incentive. So you take this and you bump it up a step farther, and I also talked to a number of developers of the archive. In fact, at the time I did these interviews, the lead developer had not known how to code before she started working on the archive. When it first came out, she said, I thought it was a great idea. I wanted it to become a reality, and I thought I'd be able to help. I wanted to learn Ruby on Rails, but probably wouldn't have been able to on my own. So AO3 gave me the possibility to learn technical skills, and in turn, I would help build the archive. I heard from many people who, for example, started out as bug testers or tag wranglers who would see what was happening, get interested, start asking questions, and then slowly get more involved with the coding. I also heard from a number of the developers who would then directly contrast this with example to open source communities. One person noted that it was really empowering. She'd come in with zero experience, and there was this attitude that everyone could learn and could be helped. And one person specifically contrasting this to her experience in open source communities said, people are allowing you to fail and make mistakes. They know that it's a labor of love, so they encourage you to get better without being like you're being terrible. It's a little more loving. Of course, we know a lot of research around some open source communities and even Wikipedia, et cetera, that we see a sort of acrimonious environment where sometimes the best way to show how great you are is to tell everyone else how terrible they are. This was basically the opposite. And one of the reasons was that, as one person put it, everyone involved in the running and creating of the site was there because they love it. We're not going to change something because we think it'll help advertisement. We're not going to change it because it involves a different feature of the site that doesn't benefit fans. The whole thing is a labor of love. And I also heard echoes of this in the many users that I've talked to about how different this is in every other platform that they use. They really trust that the site has their best interests at heart, that they're not going to do things that will harm their community, and part of the reason is because the people who are building it are them. Something that I've been thinking about lately is where this community continues to go, not just AO3, but fan fiction communities in general. So this data is from 2018. But I suspect that if we even push it a little bit farther, we might start to see a bit of a decline for Tumblr. Some of the interview data that I have is basically full of why Tumblr is not as well loved as Archive of Our Own. So Archive of Our Own does not have features for social interaction, which was a very specific decision. And so Tumblr has kind of become the place for social interaction in the absence of that on AO3. But right now, basically, there's nowhere to go. And this became really striking just about last December when we saw Tumblr's policy change an adult content ban, which has a marked impact on fandom in particular. And as I heard about this story and I started seeing reactions to it, it just felt like deja vu to what had happened to LiveJournal in 2007. And actually, if you look back at this graph, you'll see that, well, you probably can't actually see the numbers, but the LiveJournal policy change happened in 2007, and it doesn't actually start to quite precipitously fall until about 2010, which was around the time that Archive of Our Own and Tumblr start to rise. There needed to be a viable alternative option in order for people to leave. And I've been having conversations myself and my PhD students lately with people in fandom about some of their concerns about social networks and Tumblr in particular, and there are some really common problems, one of which is that Tumblr does not have granular privacy settings, and it doesn't have sub-communities. Of all the things that what people miss about LiveJournal is that you could have your, Harry Potter fan fiction community over here, and your other, anime fan fiction community over here, and you can have the one that's just for adult content that other people don't want to see over here, and all of those communities can have their own social norms, their own moderation practices, and their own privacy settings so they can keep other people out. One of the things that I study in addition to this is research ethics for public data, and a lot of people in fandom are actually quite concerned about researchers looking at their content, and also journalists, because occasionally a journalist will be like, oh, wouldn't it be funny to like put something up on BuzzFeed about, oh, this weird fan fiction stuff. And if they are interacting on Tumblr, there's no way to make it discoverable and visible to the community, but not to people not in the community. Around the time that Tumblr's adult content ban happened, myself and one of my PhD students wrote the story about how even if Tumblr falls, fandom will not. There will be something else. Though one of the problems is that we haven't quite found the something else yet. One possibility that a lot of people were talking about is Pillow Fort, which looks a bit like if LiveJournal and Tumblr had a baby. But it's a small group of developers without a ton of resources, and particularly around the time that Tumblr did the adult content ban, and a lot of people started saying, oh gosh, where are we going to go next? It kept crashing. And I worry about this kind of initiative without the kind of grassroots, huge movement behind it that AO3 had, because one of the things that I saw when I talked to developers of AO3 was that despite the massive success, there have also been a lot of challenges along the way. So the most obvious one is that it's very resource intensive to create something that's this big. AO3 is a nonprofit. They work entirely on donations, and it is an extremely important value to them that there will never be advertising, for example. But even more so than like money to keep the servers up, it's also the manpower. There is a big problem with burnout among the development experts, in particular at the beginning. And part of the reason was because this decision to train up new people rather than to bring in expert developers meant that the experts were not only having to do expert things, like build new features in the archive, they were also having to train new people. And so I talked to a number of people who said, this was great, I loved it so much, I just couldn't do it anymore. Since the time that I did this study, they have started on a very limited basis, paying some outside developers, though people that are quite well vetted by the community. There's still this issue of training bottlenecks. And in terms of other types of volunteer work, so as I mentioned, in order to make tag wrangling work, there has to be really this army of volunteers. And sometimes there can be issues with pockets of expertise, like, oh, there's not someone to do this particular fandom, or people are spread out in ways that aren't conducive to making the whole thing work. But I think that these are the kinds of things that can be solved, except really what's happened on AO3, it feels like a bit of a miracle. I mean, if you had asked me 10 years ago if this would work, I would have been very skeptical. It's taken a bit of magic, and also a huge number of people who really, really care. And I think that this also has really significant implications for broadening participation in computing and open source in terms of giving a community the resources to build their own thing, putting them in charge, giving them the decisions, but having some things to help, like training, for example. And the outcome of this is a platform that is really valued by the community in ways that I do not see elsewhere. So my favorite example of this, you often see people complaining about downtime for platforms, right? Like, Facebook's down for 5 minutes and everyone goes on Twitter to just act like their life is over, right? When Archive of Our Own goes down, the common practice of the community is for users to tweet cat pictures and tell the developers, thank you for helping. We know this must be hard for you to deal with right now. Here's some cats. And I think this is really indicative of some of the cultural things that are quite different about this platform than some other places we see. So I'm going to end my talk there. I wanted to make sure that I left a lot of time for questions. I will note that I've had some excellent collaborators on this work, and if you are the sort of person who likes to read academic papers, I've also published a couple of things on this where you can read about some things in more detail. Thanks.
I'm going to take advantage of physically being in the room to ask the first question. And my question is about onboarding, and particularly that moment. What I think is fascinating is there's this archive where there's sort of a very elaborate amount of participation. And it's reasonably clear to me that the initial process is one of, you start by reading, right? I assume very few people, they've written this whole, I don't know, Harry Potter, Sherlock mashup. Well, I mean, not that I have, but other people have. And then they come into post, right? So they're reading first. What are the processes for that onboarding such that people start to contribute and then continue to contribute over a long time? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's two kinds of contribution here. So one is certainly just fan fiction, like posting comments, reading, etc. I've talked to a lot of users over many years, and I've heard lots of stories about how you got started in fan fiction. It usually starts with reading, and it also starts with being comfortable in the community such that you can kind of put yourself out there. And part of that can have to do with seeing the positive feedback of the community to the work that's being done. Cecilia Aragon and her research group at University of Washington have been doing work related to fanfiction.net, where they have done big data analyses of comments on fanfiction. And the title of their first paper is Thousands of Positive Reviews. It is remarkable, the contrast in the comments on fan fiction compared to the comments of basically everywhere else on the internet. And that's not to say it's certainly not all rainbows and roses, right? But by and large, the social norm of the community is to be positive, to be constructive, to build people up, to help them, etc. And so seeing this makes people more comfortable with contributions of their own. In terms of people who have moved into, for example, volunteer positions on the archive or doing more technical work, I basically just hear stories about, and I wanted to do more, and I wanted to do more. Like, I was posting fan fiction, it was so great, I was getting all this great feedback, I really wanted to help. So I started doing tag wrangling, and then that got me more involved. And then I started hanging out in the Slack channel where coders were talking, and then I wanted to get more involved. And along the way, they keep getting positive feedback, and they keep feeling that they are part of the community, and that I've thought a lot about what can we learn for other online communities from the positive culture of fandom, how can we export this culture into other contexts? And I don't know. I wish I had a good answer for you. I have to say, I wonder if part of the answer is it's mostly women, which is not a particularly satisfying answer, right? But that certainly could be part of it. I also think just building social norms over a very long period of time. There's lots of people in the fandom community who are sort of here to tell you how things should be, and you don't do that. But yeah.
I have a sneaking suspicion you're actually right about the mostly women. There is some research that I never got anybody at Yahoo to actually publish, which I was told by a bird or something, which was saying that they looked at the most successful Yahoo groups over a course of something like 12 years when this was a thing, right? And the one correlate they could find that with success was having women moderators. Like, that was the one thing they could find that they were like, well, okay, now what do we do, right?
Yeah.
I have follow-up questions, but I'm going to hold off because we have a question from Alan Jeffrey. And he says, Wattpad seems to be trying to commercialize this space, such as emphasizing links to Hollywood. Are you seeing a lot of uptake of Wattpad, and is it attracting a different community than AO3?
Yeah, so that's a good question because, to be clear, there are other spaces for fan fiction than AO3. So fanfiction.net is the oldest and therefore has more works than AO3, though AO3 has grown much faster, and Wattpad is another one. There are some differences between the communities here. So fanfiction.net skews much younger than AO3, for example. And Wattpad tends to have some specific types of fandoms on it. So the other thing is that the fan fiction community, it's kind of like football fans, where like there are some cultural similarities, but like Broncos fans are going to be slightly different than Patriots fans, right? Wattpad traditionally has a lot of real person fan fiction, particularly about boy bands. And the community is slightly different. And also because of some things that happened early on with Wattpad, with, for example, the novel After that was like published, where they changed the names from being about One Direction into other random names. The culture there towards commercialism is slightly different than has been in sort of traditional fan fiction gift economy. So I think they sort of serve slightly different audiences. And I think that, and Wattpad also has both fan fiction and original fiction. And so the way that they're able to commercialize is actually, like, they're actually commercializing the original work. But sometimes that then leads to fan fiction, like filing off the serial numbers. For those of you who didn't know, 50 Shades of Grey was Twilight fan fiction. Which actually, though not copyright infringement, was a heavy norm violation of the community, because people were quite upset that you would take something out of the gift economy of fandom and profit from it. Yeah, so I would say that sites like Wattpad tend to serve slightly different purposes than AO3, for example.
All right. Do we have other questions in the rooms? I have anyone in Portland, Vancouver, Toronto, San Francisco, Mountain View.
So I think you mentioned briefly that there were some outside developers now being brought in to AO3. I guess I have two questions. One is, how are those developers being funded? I'm assuming there are, I don't know, are there advertisements that are running on AO3? Does that support developers? If so, if not, what is the source of funding? And I guess more generally, what is the way that AO3 is able to pay for server costs and things like that?
So it is entirely donation based. So there is an umbrella nonprofit, the Organization for Transformative Works. It has a fundraising drive a couple of times a year. And from my understanding, there's enough to, keep the lights on. It does things like pay for, like the legal committee has done some work around trying to, sometimes people file trademarks on things that should not be trademarks, and we have to, pay money to fight. Anyway, that sort of thing. And they had enough of a surplus of it where they were able to hire I think one developer, and not a lot, it's not like a full-time, but that was just so that there could be someone whose job it was to kind of keep things running. But yeah, the entire thing is donation-based, and that's actually a very strong value. It will never have ads. And I don't know what might happen if the donations drop off someday. But also having this nonprofit around it, there are a number of other initiatives. The AO3 is definitely the largest, but there's a wiki called FanLore that is for like preserving fan history. There's an academic journal, Transformative Works and Cultures, and then the legal committee, which is quite important because this is a type of creative work that has certainly had its copyright issues over the years. And actually, there's a very strong statement on the front page of AO3 that says, we are for transformative works, and transformative works are legal. And so there's been a lot of movement in that space.
So I have, no, you go.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I had a question about your take on the right to be forgotten and kind of cooperate with that. So right now it seems you only unlink the account, but is it possible to also remove whatever you have written?
Yes, so you can certainly just delete anything that you want to delete. And I will say that it was also quite an undertaking to make the archive GDPR compliant,
Right.
which again, and all of it, and I'm actually the only person on the legal committee that isn't a practicing lawyer or a law professor, and like, if you added up like the consulting fees or what would be the consulting fees of people who are putting their volunteer time into this, but yeah, you can. The other thing that you can do, so there is a single source of privacy, which is that you can make a work only visible to logged in users. Is the other way to deal with that. But yeah, you can also just delete all your stuff.
Okay, cool, thanks.
So I want to ask a difficult question, not in the gotcha sense, just
Okay.
as a tricky thing, which is one of the things that's notable about AO3 is the diversity and inclusivity. And you're also talking about how very welcoming that culture is and how positive it is. How does that get reconciled with the sort of the call-out culture that we're seeing about addressing issues of privilege and questions of diversity there? Because I've definitely seen in other communities that's something people are wrestling with. And I mean,
Yeah.
how does that work out? Is that an issue, right?
It definitely is. And as I said, it's I tend to speak quite positively, but again, it's not all rainbows and sunshine. So my current PhD student Brianna has done some interviews over the past couple of years, particularly with people in fandom who identify as queer, about privacy and fandom as a support space and these kinds of things. And one of the things that is definitely becoming an issue is call-out culture butting up against, for example, privacy norms in fandom. And this is indicative of a larger issue right now, which is that people value different things differently. And for example, what's more important, the intense privacy norms of fandom or calling someone out for like their fan fiction that you think is racist? Because there have been issues of people being doxxed in fandom because of being called out for something. For the most part, the people that we've spoken to like actually see this as a big problem, but this is one of the things that basically Tumblr as a platform is making worse because there are no sub-communities. So on AO3, as I explained, there's this read at your own risk kind of system. I will say there are a number of people who disagree very strongly with the content policy of AO3, which is if it is legal, you can post it. That decision was made for, in my opinion, quite good reasons, which is that it means you don't draw a line anywhere based on a value judgment. As a result, there's a lot of content on AO3 that is frankly quite abhorrent, but it is legal. And as someone on the legal committee, I've seen the worst of it because when someone writes to us and says, I'm going to call the FBI on you because of this fan fiction, it gets sent to us, and we're like, okay, who has to go look at it? And so some people disagree quite strongly with that, and as a result, think the archive is not a good place. That said, where do you draw the line, right? But the issue on Tumblr is that there's everything is bunched together. You can't like go on Tumblr and only interact with the people who you know will not find this content objectionable. So, I mean, this problem is on a lot of platforms. Like, to me, the big problem with Twitter is that Twitter is not a community. And so you have tons of communities with different norms, all of whom are operating under the same policy. I think that in order to solve this problem, so here, wave my magic wand, fandom needs a new social network that has granular privacy settings and sub-communities. And that would, I think, solve a lot of
we can do about that. Okay.
Yeah, I think that would solve a lot of the problems.
Okay, I got two questions remotely. We have Josh. Do you want to go first in Toronto?
Sure. I tried. I was interested in contributing code to AO3. I think maybe a year ago or so, and I was surprised to find at the time there seemed to be a message that said, "We have enough developers. We will ask for more when we need them." And I'm curious how that relates to the stories of people being so driven to like make AO3 better that like they learned to code and contributed through that way. Do you know if that's like a policy thing or something that happened?
Yeah, so I've heard about, particularly now. In the early days, there were not as many people clamoring to help, and I think. I haven't been told about these things specifically, but I have a feeling there have been some people who have come in to help and have ended up not being good community members. At least this is I have heard sort of this implied to me. And so I think they're a bit gun shy about bringing in, especially people where it's not like, you can't point to like, oh, I've been writing fan fiction for the past 10 years and here's my sort of community cred. At least that would be my guess. I mean, as I said, I feel like they've had these problems with not having enough people to train and et cetera. And in some ways that could be solved by like opening up more. I don't know, but I agree. I think it's probably an issue.
Okay. Christopher Arnold, you're in San Francisco. And you should ask a question.
You're AD muted.
I can't hear you. How about that?
Oh, yes, cool, thanks. Twitter is the third largest trend. What are people doing? Using Twitter as the hosting platform or as a table of contents or something else?
Social interaction. So the other interesting thing about sort of transformative fandom as a community is that there are two major functions. So there's an archiving function and a social function, and the different sites that were shown on that graph, for example, have served one or both. So like LiveJournal was both archive and social. Tumblr is only social. AO3 is only archive. Twitter. And I will say that, for example, you will notice that Facebook was not on that graph. And Facebook does have granular privacy settings and sub-communities. However, it requires you to use your real name. And that will never happen in fandom.
All right. Did we have another question in the room? Do you want to do a quick one?
And forgive me, my allergies are getting the best of me today. First thing, just an observation, what you were talking about earlier about education and call-out culture in response to Joe Fish's question. It feels like fandom has already gone a long way towards some of the things that we've talked about in transformative justice, and even from if you look at the late 80s, early 90s, the critical legal studies movement, which I find is fascinating. The question I had is that you talked some about archiving, and I think most visible to technologists is the work that the Internet Archive does. So I was curious how you work with the Internet Archive. Are they even aware of what you're doing doing? Are they taking credit for what y'all are doing?
So I do know that we have a relationship with that. They are certainly aware of us. I don't know a lot about like the specific relationship there, but as far as I know, we're all friends. I mean, I think I would say that, you know, one thing about the Internet Archive is that it doesn't do something that you asked about earlier, which is being able to, this strong value of being able to delete your stuff if you want to, right? So that actually butts up a little bit against some of the values here, but so I mean, in a way, Archive of Our Own was a way of like doing the strong value towards preservation while also trying to respect that important value as well.
Cool. All right, I'm going to wrap up because we're out of time, partly because I got really excited asking you questions. Thank you all very much, and I want to mention that we'll have our next speaker in this series. I believe is going to be Thursday the 1st of July, where Wendy Jew is going to be talking about self-driving cars, which is a different take on data in the world. So please join me in thanking Casey very much.